How do we create a good argument? You know, there's only two ways to convince somebody that something is true. Either we can use some sort of power over a person, or we can try and convince them logically. People might try and use power by, if they're just a charismatic type of a person, perhaps they could lean in and use their voice and their intonation and their rhetoric, and they just convince people. There's people like that. And people can learn to hone their powers of persuasion to try and push people into believing something. And often, some of our church services and how the worship and everything is structured is meant to coerce people into believing something as well. You could use peer pressure, and that's another tool that is sometimes used to bring conversions to Christianity. As well, you can use tactics such as brainwashing or inundating people with a certain way of thinking and not allowing other ways of thinking into their experience until they believe something, or simply not allowing somebody to express a belief to the contrary. And all these things have been used, unfortunately, by Christians to try and bring converts. But the better way to convert somebody is to bring reasonable and rational arguments to say, here is the truth, here's why I believe this, and not to bring force and coercion to bear, but just laying out the argument in a straightforward and systematic way so that somebody can make up their own mind. And as I mentioned in the very first video that I recorded here, there's such a problem, number one, with people not converting to Christianity, but also short-lived conversions. And I think that a big reason that there's short-lived conversions in the church is that we're relying too much on these coercive forms of conversion, and we're not looking carefully enough at how to present the gospel in a systematic, in a logical way, answering the questions that people have, and creating a good, concrete, and workable worldview within their minds so that they have something to work with, something to go on from this point forward. So I'm going to describe for you how to create a deductive argument. This isn't the only way to think, it's not the only way to speak, but it is kind of the bread and butter of how we in the West think and process information. And I would argue, I won't argue it here for purposes of time, but I would argue this is basic to human thought, and I would even go so far as to say this is basic to divine thought. We think this way because God thinks this way. That's not true when you get into extreme variations of deductive reasoning, but just the basics of it. Saying this is true, therefore here's the conclusion. The law of non-contradiction that I'm going to talk about just now. I think that this is basic to normal, honest, rational thought, and I believe God is a normal, honest, rationally thinking being. I believe that this way of thinking is part of how God thinks and speaks to us. Before moving on, deductive reasoning is based on the law of non-contradiction. And this is the law that I mentioned in the first video. I kind of skated around it and then I mentioned it right at the end. It is the belief that something is either true or false. There's no in-between, there's no mishmash of it's both and. The law of non-contradiction says something cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same sense. Now right away you'll say, well, what about this, what about this? Okay, at the same time, in the same sense. That's going to answer a lot of the objections that jump to your mind right away. Somebody could die and not die at the same time. Well, not in the same sense. Either they died or they didn't die. In the same time, the same sense. So this is based on the law of non-contradiction. So based on this, we believe that things are either true or they're false. We can bring forward a premise. A premise is a truth claim. Say, for example, I could say, that rock is black. And what I mean by that is that rock is really black. Not just my perspective of it, I believe that that rock is black. If God was looking at that rock, he would say the rock is black. My perspective isn't perfect, but it's somewhat okay, and I think that the rock is black. Now, I might also bring a second premise and say, all black rocks are coal. You know, based on my experience, based on what I know, I'm making a truth claim. Now, based on these two truth claims, we have a conclusion that flows logically and systematically, logically and inescapably from these two truth claims. Therefore, this rock is coal. Now, premises are, as I said, are truth claims. They're either true or false. The conclusion, we wouldn't say is true or false. We would say that it is valid, either a valid or an invalid conclusion. Now, there's two ways that a conclusion can fail. Either one of the premises is incorrect, or else the argument is not structured very well, or it's not structured validly. It's an invalid argument. For example, in this example that I gave you, the second premise fails. All black rocks are not coal. Therefore, the second premise is incorrect. We know obsidian, we know some basalt, and other rocks are black, but they are not coal. Therefore, this argument fails. The conclusion is incorrect. The other way that an argument can fail is if it's structured incorrectly. And we're going to go into great lengths with this in the next session, some of the logical fallacies. But just to give you an example, I could say that rock is black, all roses are red, therefore this rock is coal. And you say, well, this second proposition, it's true. Well, actually it isn't true. It isn't true, and it's also not valid. It has nothing to do with rocks. We're talking about rocks. And so it's this premise doesn't fit the argument. It doesn't bring the argument forward, and this conclusion does not flow from these two premises. And so the argument is built incorrectly, and so it fails on that ground. Now, how it's going to be helpful for us to be able to work with deductive reasoning is that, first of all, it's going to enable us to argue well, and secondly, it'll enable us to think well. There's many detractors, especially in progressive Christianity or in the emergent church, that will say deductive reasoning is out. We need to tell stories instead of using deductive reasoning. But it's amazing how even in saying something like that, such as deductive reasoning is part of the past, we need to look forward and use something like stories. If you look at the components of what they're actually saying, they're saying premise one, deductive reasoning is old and outdated. Premise two is kind of a hidden premise that anything new is better. Therefore, the conclusion is that we should no longer use deductive arguments. And so the order of things is kind of mushed around in the sentence, but that's basically what they're saying. They're using a deductive argument. And what we're going to find once we get into this, and hopefully you guys as a class can talk more about this and workshop it a little bit, you're going to realize this is just basic to how we think and how we talk as human beings. It's impossible to escape from this sort of a thing. But the great beauty of being able to lay it out like this, here's the premise, here's the second premise, here's the conclusion, is that it helps us visualize the argument so that we can have more meaningful discussions about things or about whatever we're talking about. We can have a more meaningful and constructive discussion. For example, somebody might say, science disproves Christianity. It's a statement. But as a deductive thinker, I would say, well, that statement is just floating off in midair. Tell me what your premises are. How do you get there? How would you support that? Now, perhaps somebody would say, well, it's because of the Big Bang. The Big Bang is scientifically proven the Big Bang has been proven by science. So that's premise one. Premise two, if the Big Bang is true, Christianity must be false. Therefore, science has disproven Christianity. Okay, now we have two truth claims that we can start working on. Is it actually true that the Big Bang is proven by science? We can go into this. We can have a meaningful discussion about whether this is true or false. Secondly, is it true if the Big Bang is true, Christianity is false? We can have another meaningful discussion about that truth claim so that we can come eventually to the decision of whether or not this conclusion flows logically and inescapably from these two premises. If we just talk about this statement, we're going to get into an emotional argument. We're going to get sidetracked with he said, she said, something about history, something about, we're not going to have a very meaningful conversation. But if we get to the heart of things, we're going to be able to have a very meaningful conversation. So it's going to help us tremendously in our apologetic efforts. It's also going to help us think better. Now, one of the main objections to this sort of thought, to deductive reasoning, is, look, people don't think that way. Especially today, we're in a postmodern age. People think in pictures, in images, in stories. People don't sit down and say, here's my point one, here's my point two, here's my conclusion. Nobody speaks that way. So what's the purpose of learning to think in that way? And the purpose is so that you yourself can think clearly, in order to be able to engage with people. One of my life verses is Matthew 15:32, which says, in essence, Jesus is speaking and saying, any scribe who converts to me, or who is a child of the kingdom, is like the master of a store, or a head of a household, who has in his storeroom things both old and new. And the idea is that a head of a household would have a well-stocked pantry, and things are in there, they're all laid out on shelves, they're all organized, and he has lots of good things. So that he can go in there and get some really old cheese, he can get some really old wine, mix that in with some really nice fresh veggies, and some really nice, medium-aged bread, and take that out and make a feast for the people that are coming. This is what we as people that are being trained for the ministry need to become. We need to have a full storeroom of information that we can draw on, so that when we get up to preach, maybe we have 10 minutes in front of a youth group, and we got to be snappy, we got to be funny, we got to be smart, we got to be witty. But we're taking things out of our storeroom. We're not just off the cuff saying whatever comes to us. We know we have a very well-developed worldview, and from that we draw on that to bring maybe a story, an illustration, something flashy, something fun to keep the kids interested. Or if we're standing up in front of a church for 20 minutes to 40 minutes for preaching, we might have illustrations to keep them awake. We might have, talking about contemporary world events. We might be talking about a whole variety of things. But we're drawing on our storehouse of information. And I'd like to encourage you, as you continue in your studies at NBC, your studies have relevance. And you might say, well, when am I ever going to use this information in a sermon? Well, you might not. But it's part of constructing a thorough and a systematic worldview, so that you understand what the truth is. And from that you can draw a morsel, or you can draw ingredients to bring the truth in a relevant and a helpful way to people. So I hope you're not feeling lost. It's so simple. It's perhaps so simple that it starts to get confusing. But let's not make it confusing. We're just making one or more truth claims and saying this is true, therefore here is the conclusion. That's all that we mean when we say deductive reasoning. And I think that this will get even more clear when we get into some of the logical fallacies and some of the ways that deductive reasoning starts to fall apart, and we can identify people on the errors in their thinking or the errors in our thinking and avoid them.